All right, so I'm going to pick up the What is Culture lecture that I had for you guys this last Monday. Before you took the test, we started getting into chapter 4. And so remember that you need to open up the key term slides for chapter 4. I put those, I believe, I want to say in week number 9. If not, check in week number 10, but it's in one of the folders. Make a copy of those and make sure you're putting those in as I go through here. Okay, and so the next key term we're going to cover is going to be a habit. Now, a habit is the repeated behavior or action of a particular individual. And so that might be that, that particular person is always running late. And so it's repeated over and over again by that particular person. Whereas another person may have the habit of they always, come to events, school, whatever appointments totally on time, or maybe even early. And they do that over and over and over and over again. That is a habit. And so when you make your key term card, you're welcome to use what I have, or think of habits that you know people have or you have and use that as your example. Now, whereas a habit is a repeated behavior or action by an individual, when we talk about a culture trait, or what is commonly referred to as a custom, this is a repeated behavioral pattern of an entire group of people in certain situations. And so, think of like a greeting. So in France, you can see on the picture on the bottom left, their repeated behavior pattern of their group in the certain situation of greeting is to give, kind of a kissing action on the cheek. Whereas for us, we know that in that situation, our group does something different. We shake with our right hands. We grasp the other person's right hand. It's always typically the right hand. And we do something where we are shaking hands. Now, subgroups, subcultures may have something different. So you might dap, or you might do something where, you're doing something similar, but maybe it is part of a subculture, but that group does that always in that situation. Another one would be like the tooth fairy. I mean, think of how interesting that culture trait is. You rip out a bloody tooth and you put it under a pillow and you expect a little fairy to come along while you're sleeping and give you money or give you some reward for your bloody tooth. But when you're a little kid, your parents do this over and over and over again. And, that's a culture trait of Americans. Now, you can also see in the picture there for funerals. We typically, in America, especially if you're a Christian, now, if you're not a Christian, you may not do this, but since most Americans typically are Christian, in that situation, they bury their dead. And typically, they bury their dead 6 feet down. And so those are multiple examples of a culture trait. Okay, a taboo. A taboo is a behavior that is not culturally acceptable to a group of people. And typically what happens is that the sociophacts, they regulate that behavior. And so, you can see the picture of the Seinfeld episode where the guy is a close talker. And, that's typically a taboo. We don't want to smell that guy's breath, and we don't want, them to come into our space bubble. And so, if you look at the woman, she is backing away, and that's a sociophact. That's her trying to regulate his behavior, saying, hey, that is not okay. That is what we call taboo. And so, we have a lot of different taboos that you probably don't even realize, but, think about how many times when you're growing up that your parents say, hey, don't do this or don't do that, or, hey, we're in public, don't do that. Those are all regulations of your behavior. Those sociophacts are pointing out what are taboo. And so you can see with the picture, you don't want to pick your nose. If you're going to eat spaghetti, you want to use a fork. You don't want to use your hands. Whereas other sociophacts will say, hey, it's okay to, eat pizza with your hands, but we don't believe it's okay to eat spaghetti with your hands. And if you do, we're going to look at you like you're doing something wrong. Okay, so that's a taboo. And there's all sorts of them. And what's kind of interesting is that certain cultures have even things like food taboos. So we know that like Jewish people don't typically eat pork. Muslim people typically don't either. We know that Hindu people, because the cow is sacred in that culture, that cows are not going to be eaten. And so when McDonald's goes to sell their McDonald's meals in India, they're going to have to what we call localize. They're going to have to change their type of food that they serve so that they don't offend local taboos. Muslims do not drink alcohol. So those are all food taboos or drink taboos. So there's lots of different levels and layers of taboos in societies. Okay, the next one is kind of a complex, type of concept to understand. So I'll explain this a couple different ways, and you can kind of think of it in terms of your own life or something like that to try to make your example, but I'll give you a couple as well. All right, a culture complex. This is a collection of traits that either make up like a subculture, a particular aspect of culture, or even kind of an entire culture. So if we said, what's the culture complex of Americans? Well, Americans are always on the go. Americans typically are kind of rude. Americans, we like to show off wealth, and we like to, we like people to know us. We like fame. That's why people are always posting stuff on the internet so they can get seen, and how many followers you have. All of those things, that's part of our culture complex. But you don't have to do an entire culture. You can do like an aspect of culture, or you can do a subculture. So if we kind of look at the subculture of football fans, and you take a look at these people that are going to a football game, or to watch a football game, or to tailgate. There's certain behavior traits that make up, or culture traits that make up this whole idea of being a fan of football. So, you might go and eat a certain type of food. And so when you're tailgating, or if you're eating, you're going to be eating chicken wings or some sort of fried or unhealthy food typically. You might be drinking beer. You might be watching other games. You can see these people, they're wearing jerseys, but yet they're not playing in the game. So there's all these aspects that make up a culture complex. So you kind of take all those culture traits. If you're thinking of it like an equation, you think culture trait plus culture trait plus culture trait plus culture trait, and you add all those up together, and that equals a culture complex. Okay. And, behaviors in this particular culture complex, they may be perfectly normal. So if you look at the picture in the top right-hand corner, it appears like these people have gone stark crazy mad, but really all they're doing is cheering that their team got an interception or a touchdown or something like that. And within that group, that behavior is perfectly normal and actually rather encouraged. Okay. So again, you take all those culture traits, you add them up, that's a culture complex. All right, a cultural hearth. As you can see there, a cultural hearth is a core area within which a set of culture traits, ideas, and technologies develops and diffuses. So the example that I'm using here is the religion of Islam. And so the cultural hearth is going to be the Arabian Peninsula. And we can see that from the cities of Medina and Mecca, that the religion of Islam diffused through relocation diffusion and went out to Northern Africa, the Middle East, into Asia, and into Southeastern Europe. And so the kind of the cultural hearth is where it begins. It's that core area. It may not be a specific node, and it can be. Really, if you're going to try to pin a node to Islam, it'd probably be Mecca. But think of a hearth as more like an area in which those values, those ideas, those artifacts, sociofacts, and menefacts, they start in that area and then they diffuse from there. Okay, a cultural region. A cultural region is an area with just similar cultural traits. So if we looked at America as a culture region, we could find fairly similar. It's not going to be uniform by any means, but if you look at what most language people speak, it'd be English. Most people would be, for religion would be Christianity. So you can think of America as a region, but we tend to break it down. We tend to, as we remember, we change scales. And so, if you're looking at this map, you can see that this has to do with religion, which is a very important aspect of culture. And you're looking at the different denominations of Christianity. And so you can see that the red is an area with a similar cultural belief in the idea of being a Baptist. And typically these people believe that you need to be an adult of some kind before you get baptized. Whereas, Catholics, they oftentimes are, the way their group does things, they're going to baptize people oftentimes when they're babies, when they're first born. So when you look at that area, it doesn't have to be 100%. If you're looking at the south there, the Baptist Belt, it doesn't have to be 100% red. But it's an area with like a dominant kind of cultural characteristic here. And I'm just using religion in this case, but it could be any kind of cultural aspect. Okay, here's one for language. If you want to use this for your example, you can see the areas where people call a soft drink a pop. The red where they call it a Coke. So like if you go to the South, I remember going to dinner with my cousin who has lived in Kentucky now for about 30 years. And she speaks like a Southerner. She's kind of been assimilated into Southern culture. And when she asks for a soda, she says, "I'll have a Coke." And the next question the waitress asks is, "What kind?" And so, whereas here, if you ask for a Coke, you're going to get a Coca-Cola. They're going to ask you, "Do you want a Sprite Coke, or do you want a, something like that?" Where the Coke is kind of the substitute word for a soda or a soda pop. All right, a culture realm. A culture realm is transcendent of borders. So it is kind of the entire area of the world for a particular cultural aspect. And the one you're seeing here is the Indo-European language family, which encompasses languages like English, like Spanish, ones like, Hindi, Balto-Slavic languages that are Eastern European. Those ones are all in Indo-European. And so that Indo-European region is, it's gigantic, and it transcends borders. So, if you take a look and you say everything that is an Indo-European language family, that is going to be put in this kind of purplish blue color. That is a culture realm. So it's not one area. It's really kind of think of it again as an equation. A culture region plus a culture region plus a culture region plus a culture region plus a culture region makes up a culture realm. So if we add up like the North American cultural region for Indo-European plus the culture region for the Indo-European versions of those languages in South America, and you keep adding those up, you get the culture realm for Indo-European language families. Okay, here would be the Christian world. So everything that is in the, basically the purple and maybe a little bit of the pink, that is the Christian region realm, as we would call it, or the Christian realm. All right, next concept, cultural core, domain, and sphere. So you're going to be doing 3 key term cards here. So let's start with a cultural core. Cultural core is a characteristic that is overwhelmingly dominant. So what we're going to show you here is a map, and whatever that characteristic is in that particular place, wherever the core is, you're talking that almost everyone fits that cultural characteristic. And usually if you want to kind of quantify this and put a percent to it, you're talking about over 90%. So the characteristic is overwhelmingly dominant in this particular area. We would call that the cultural core. And if I don't give you an example right away, that's okay. I'm going to here in just a second. Okay, the cultural domain. This is where again, if we quantify, over 50% of the people share whatever cultural characteristic is in that area. It's not as dominant as the core. So you kind of see these as functional regions, where now we're talking about a functional region of a cultural characteristic. And so, we're not talking about like a radio station or anything like that. We're talking about, hey, here's where the cultural hearth is. And in this core area, most of the people are going to be this particular characteristic. If it's the core, it's going to be almost everybody. And then the cultural sphere, now we're kind of moving away from the core most likely, and we still have a good number of people that are sharing this particular characteristic, but it's not 50%. It's probably less than 50%. But it's a clustering of people that fit the same cultural characteristic, whatever it may be. All right, so let's look at the Mormon Church or Latter-day Saints. And if we say, where is the cultural core, then, definitely you're going to want to say, well, it's Utah. Okay? And you can see it there in the darkest colors there. But as we kind of move to the periphery, the outside, kind of the edge of Utah, you're going to see that we're going to go from the really, really dark red to the kind of just dark red. And then as we get into a place like Idaho, northern Idaho, or western Nevada, western Colorado, moving east in Colorado, that is where we get that sphere. So the cultural core is going to be probably the state of Utah. The domain is going to be, kind of the periphery of Utah. And then the sphere is going to be the states bordering Utah. So something like that. Okay, cultural diffusion. This one's really easy. We've talked about different types of diffusion, but now we're just going to put it in terms of culture. So when we talk about diffusion, remember it's the spread of a characteristic, and really all we mean here is the spread of a cultural characteristic. Okay, so remember that most of the time in history that cultural diffusion has spread by relocation diffusion, but now a lot of times those cultural characteristics can get carried by expansion diffusion. So make sure that you go over each kind of those. But I would tend to say that cultural diffusion, at least in history so far, has been through relocation diffusion. You look at the Columbian Exchange as a good example, where people from the European and African continents brought over to the New World things like chickens and horses and onions and peaches and pigs. And they brought back from the old world, back from the New World, from North America and South America, things like corn and beans, cocoa and pineapple and tomatoes, turkeys, things like that had never been in Europe. And so that's a good example of diffusion. Now, when we talk about specifically cultural diffusion, now we're talking about the movement of something like a language or a religion, something maybe like a mannerism or a behavior. Those would be more examples that you would want to put down for cultural diffusion. So if we go back to our Columbian Exchange picture there in the middle, we would say something like, Spanish people brought over the language of Spanish. And that would be a good example of a cultural characteristic diffuse. You can see Disneyland. I mean, Disneyland that's our culture, and you can see it there in Hong Kong, China. Okay, so if we take a look at this again, we would say this is relocation diffusion. The way that Islam spread throughout these places was by missionaries going, soldiers going and spreading the Islamic religion that way. Okay, last two slides. Folk culture. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the coming week, but we're going to give you kind of a basic outline of what folk culture is. So folk culture is culture that changes very little over time, whereas the culture we're going to talk about that you belong in, it's rapidly changing. It changes all the time. And with folk culture, you could go 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, and it does not change a whole lot. And so, the way the language progresses, the way the songs the way that people sing, those things, modes of transportation, way they dress, that's going to change very little over time in folk culture. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bunch of kind of characteristics of what make a folk culture a folk culture. First of all, it's reinforced from generation to generation. And so what we mean by that is it's reinforced by the adults. The adults create the culture, the adults maintain the culture, and then they pass it on and they make sure that the younger generation follows it. And if you take a look at the bottom picture, you see a group of people called the Amish. And, the Amish culture, if it's a true Amish culture, is very rigid and very regulated by the adults. And if the young people want to be a part of that culture, they pretty much have to, give up their own personal ideas and do what is asked of them. And then they get older and they have kids and they do the same thing to their kids. And, that's very different from your culture, where a lot of times it's the younger generation developing the culture, and the old people having to adapt to it. All right, so where do we find folk cultures? Well, not around here. You're going to find folk cultures in isolated areas. A lot of these people tend to isolate themselves. Change is threatening to their culture, and so they work to isolate themselves. And even though, like the Amish, most of them are right outside of Philadelphia, they don't interact with Philadelphia and Pennsylvania very much. They tend to kind of self-isolate themselves. But if you want to look around the world, rainforests, deserts, mountain areas like the Caucasus, those areas provide places where those groups can kind of isolate themselves, and then they have a very homogenous type of character where, if you go into that area, you're going to find only one language, you're going to find only one religion. You're going to find kind of one way of doing things, and that's reinforced generation after generation after generation. They're going to develop their own style of kind of, fashion or clothing. You can see that with President Obama with Native Americans, and you can see how his fashion is very well up to date, but the Native Americans' fashion seems to be frozen in time. That is because Native Americans are resisting the change that America brought on, and they're trying to preserve their culture, and therefore they're going to dress very differently than you or I. Typically in folk culture, and really, guys, in any culture, there's always tremendous pressure to conform. And remember, that's the socioeffects. That's other people regulating your behavior. And hey, there are things that you do, and there's things you're not supposed to do. And if you do those things, and you can be in our group. And if you don't do those things, well, then you need to go find another group. So, this one is not particularly unique to folk culture. I think all cultures do this, but definitely is a common feature of folk cultures. Kind of an interesting one is that folk cultures, and this isn't always true. If we went to the rainforest, we might see some slash and burn farming or something like this, but compared to popular culture, and we'll give examples of this later for popular culture, but folk cultures typically impact the environment and the landscape very little. And, a good example of this is like the use of land. And so the Amish, they farm, but they don't put pesticides, they don't put herbicides, they don't frack for oil and things like that our culture does. So that's a good example of the little impact on the environment. Okay, culture tends to spread very slowly. I mean, these people are isolated. They don't like to interact a lot with the outside world. And so, it happens pretty slowly and typically by relocation diffusion. Typically, their culture only spreads when the people of that culture move and expose other people to it. Now, something else I alluded to was what we call a homogeneous cultural group. These people typically are not very diverse. And so whatever their ethnicity is, if you went to every person in that culture group, they're going to be of the same ethnicity. And what we mean by that is not necessarily racially, but a lot of times they are. I mean, if you go to a Amish community, most of the people are going to be Caucasian because most of those people are from Germany, and they were of European descent. But what I mean mostly is that they are going to speak the same language. So again, if we use the Amish, we'd say, most of these people are going to speak English, but they're also going to speak Pennsylvania Dutch, and that's unique to that group. It's their version of German. They're going to eat certain foods. They're going to dress a certain way. And pretty much everybody in that group does that. They're very homogenous. There's not a lot of what we call diversity. Right? And so folk cultures tend to be very homogenous. Okay, where we'll end today is with popular culture. And I love putting these pictures up here because half of them aren't even really popular anymore, or the icons that I've put up are out of date. But that's the point. The point is that popular culture changes all the time. And, you might like a song one month and the next month you never want to hear it again. A person might be popular at one time and then they're old news. the one I always like to use is Facebook. When Facebook first came out, it was all the rage with teenagers. Teenagers were on Facebook, college kids were on Facebook, and then it became mainstream. It became old news, and so students and college students, they started saying, "Oh my gosh, my mom and my dad are on Facebook now," and so they got off it, and all of a sudden it was like teenagers, Facebook was just awful, and we don't like it anymore. And you moved on. You moved on to TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and all these other things because that's what's new. That's what you like, and so that is popular culture. So I don't think I really need to give you too many examples with popular culture. I'm pretty sure that you can figure out an example to use. Certainly, you could tell better than the old person that's speaking to you right now. All right, so that should be it for this particular lecture. I will post another lecture of culture on Friday, and that will I'm sorry. Let me say that again. I will post another lecture on Monday. So this upcoming Monday, at some point you need to watch the next culture video lecture. All right. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great